My stubborn will at last have yielded. I would be thine and thine alone. And this a prayer my lips are bringing, for heaven be thy will be done.
Good. I've got it green now. Perfect. So good morning. My name is David Parsley. For those of you who don't know me, this morning we're going to continue our study on Acts. So this quarter and last quarter we've been working through Acts chapter by chapter. So we're going to pick up here this week on the chapter that we're on. But we'll give everybody a chance to get seated first. So today we'll pick up where we left off last week. Bart walked us through. I'll lower this down. I feel really loud. Bart left us off here in the last part of Paul's story, where it says, "Then Agrippa said to Festus, 'This man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar.'" So that was the last verse of Acts chapter 26. When he says that, questions that we have, at least in my mind, when Bart was going through that last week, was, do you really think that would have been the case? Do you really think that he would have been let free? I highly doubt it based on the situation. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that, but it seems very unlikely to me that that would have been the case. But it also seems that the one that does know is God, and it seems weird to me to allow Paul to struggle like he did if he could have just been set free then and there in 26. So for him to go forward and deal with the struggle he's about ready to go through here in Acts 27 and later on, it seems weird that if he would have been set free, then why let him go through that? So in this chapter, we're going to jump into Acts 27, so that's where we'll spend. So if you would, turn your Bible to Acts 27. We won't start reading in there yet. But that's where we will study this morning. And I do enjoy discussion, so if you would like to add any comments at any point during the time, please do so. Otherwise, I'll end up speeding through this whole thing because I'm not a very talkative person. And so I'll go through very, very quickly. So if any point in time you decide you want to add some comments, please do so. I would really enjoy those. I enjoyed them last time that I got to do this class. So I appreciate those things. So in Acts 27, hopefully you can see that map pretty well. This is Paul's journey that he's about ready to go forward. So where we left off in 26, he's over here in Caesarea Maritima. Forgive my pronunciations for these words because I will tell you I will struggle with that. But that's where we left off, and that's where we're going to start and continue on. Now what you'll notice about this journey is that we will not make it all the way to Rome today. So chapter 27, we'll be able to get all the way from over here to Malta, and that's where we'll stop. So if you want to know what happens and how Paul gets to Rome, well, you'll have to tune in next week. So Bart will be able to finish that out next week. And he did tell me that there was no pressure to finish all 27 because he could go through the rest of 27 if needed. So he gave me a thumbs up, so that I'm not lying to you. But I don't think we'll have any problem getting through 27. But that gives you an idea of where you're at. And you may see this map come up a few other times as well as we go through this discussion this morning. The outline, the way that when I read it in my New King James Version, they've got these headings in there. So I like those headings. So I left those headings in there for laying out how we'll look through this chapter this morning. You'll see in the beginning, we start our voyage to Rome. That will be the first 8 verses of chapter 27. Then Paul gives them a warning around verse 9 through 12, a short little section there where they ignore Paul's warning that they gave him. The bulk of the chapter is in the tempest, so the actual storms that they're going to suffer. And then the last little section, when they make it to Malta, there will be the shipwreck there that they have on Malta. As I started to study this and get prepared for this lesson this week, one question kept coming up in my mind, and maybe you all have an answer to it, is why is this recorded in so much detail in Acts 27? Any thoughts? Why so much detail related to this journey? Does it contribute to understanding of God's will? Does it contribute to understanding what the Christians were going through? What do you think? Any thoughts on that? Okay. I think that's a great point. So showing that connection between what Paul was hearing from God, and they should have listened to what Paul was saying because he was really the man of God, right? Trying to deliver that message. I think that's a great point.
It also gives authenticity to the narrative. They took the sounding at 20 fathoms, 50, and he's using the marine language, or the ones that would be understood by the mariners, and it just gives it authenticity.
That's good. So bring up the point of connecting to the audience, right? And those mariners, those sailors, that type of audience that would have been listening to those things. So very good point there. Anything else? Okay. If I miss you, just yell at me. So some of those things I found in the same commentaries trying to research this and study it, and sea voyages were very popular in literature of the time. No doubt that Paul probably would have known that. He was a well-educated person. As we would think back in those times in these stories, this is very similar to what we see today. If the person lived, people would have viewed them as a hero, right? If the person would have died, we would have seen them as a villain. And so those same themes follow true with a lot of our narratives today. So that's one aspect that was given. Other thing, it provides us a window on how people of that time period traveled, which is very interesting as time continues to change. Understanding what someone had to suffer through and go through is important to us because it's important to see that we're not the only people that are going to struggle, and they struggle with a lot of things that luckily that we don't have to struggle with today and day-by-day life. But the other thing, and I think this was raised earlier, is reminds us that God's always in control. I think that's the one message I think you can see all the way through chapter 27, is that God is always in control of the situation. Even when we don't understand what's really going on or it feels uncomfortable to us, it's really His divine will that we have to remember to pay attention to. Now, as I get into a little bit of the background, I could probably spend a lot of time going through the background of this. At least when I was studying it, this is where I kept getting stuck, as I wanted to get into more and more of the background behind the story. From a lot of the timeline, we see that this most likely occurred in late 59 AD, in that fall time frame, and we'll show some other evidence during the study of why that is the case. So that's when it really began. The journey ended around 60 AD in Acts 28 when you get into what Bart will walk through with you next Sunday. The length of the journey, as I started studying this, I found this interesting website called orbis.stanford.edu, and they study all these different routes of the Roman world and all these different ports. And you can put a starting port and an ending port, and it will tell you what most likely was the journey that they have taken, either land or by sea, depending on if you wanted the fastest journey, the lowest cost journey. It was really interesting. I had never seen that before. Maybe some of you have. But using that as a reference, look to see that normally this journey that Paul took should have taken about 29 days, so about a month. We know that's not what happened, but it should have taken about 29 days, and he would have traveled roughly 3,000 kilometers. I'm not a kilometers person, so I have to think of in terms of miles. So that's a little bit less than 2,000 miles that he would have traveled from his starting point back to Rome. Thinking about that, when you talk about 2,000 miles, that's a long distance, right? So what does that mean for us? If we were to leave this location and travel to Phoenix, Arizona, that's about the same amount of distance if we're driving by car. And so it gives you an idea of the journey that he had ahead of him. Now, even of that journey, if we were to take it and leave from this building, this parking lot location, so I plugged into the GPS. There are some other routes, but that was the one that got me closest to the 1822. But if we were to jump in the car and drive from right here and go all the way to Phoenix, it would take us about 27 hours by car. I'm sure some of us could make it a little bit faster than that. But on average, 27 hours by car. And he would have to spend a month on the boat. And we know that that extends way past the month of his whole journey. So it gives us some perspective of what he had to deal with during that time period, which I think is helpful for us as we consider what we have to walk through. The other thing that I wanted to look at is, what did Rome look like during that time period? How big was the empire of Rome? I found this map. This is the closest one I could find. I know it's a little grainy. I apologize. But right there at 60 AD, this in the light blue was the territory under the Roman Empire. Look how far that they had spread. So you can see Rome there, but they were spreading at this current period of time. They were spreading into what we think of as England, and they were making inroads into Germania, or what we would call Germany region today. They were also pushing eastward towards Armenia. I think they conquered in around 60 AD. And so they were spread everywhere. You can see how they dipped down into Egypt. So it's very expansive. It's not just that little area around Rome and through Italy. They are very, very large at this point in time. The other thing I had a question about was Paul appealed to Caesar, right? So who was Caesar during this period of time? Anybody know? That's a little guy we may know by the name of Nero. So what do we know Nero for? Say that again. Burning of Rome. Right? So you got to think, Nero's been in power at this point 5 to maybe 6 years. Paul, I don't know whether he knows that or not, but he may know that Nero is the Roman emperor, also known as the Caesar at that period of time, or he may not. But some key points as you look at Nero's history, when he first started, he hadn't really lost his mind yet. He was pretty normal, just another Caesar. But a key event happened in 59 where he assassinated his mother. So he had his mother assassinated, and after that period of time, his mental state rapidly deteriorated. So things went way south. So I don't know that Paul necessarily knew this, and I don't think there's any way for us to know by looking at the scriptures. But what's interesting is that all this would have happened around the same time. So we do know that God knows what's going to happen. And so you kind of wonder, Paul's wanted to go to Rome for a long time, right? Now he's finally getting his chance to go to Rome. And we know that when he gets to Rome, he's going to be able to teach the message for a few years there in the house that he rented. And God knows what Nero is going to do to the Christians and trying to destroy Christianity. And so you just have to wonder about those connecting points. Obviously, it's all just opinion. But you think that with God knowing all those things, there has to be some importance to that. So that is the background as we start to study this. But now we jump into the actual scriptures. And so this first section, the voyage to Rome, begins. If we would, turn to Acts 27, and we'll look at the first couple verses here. I've got them up on the screen. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of, let me see about this, Adramyttium, that one's a hard one for me, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So from this first passage, we understand that Paul is not alone. There's a few key points there. He's one of many prisoners that are headed to Rome. It's not only Paul going to Rome as a prisoner. He's one of many. So the other thing that we notice is that Julius, he was a centurion, was in command of those prisoners at this time. Now, if you do search the scriptures, and I didn't put the references up here, but in looking through the different commentaries, centurions mostly have a favorable reputation in the scriptures, which is interesting, but they typically have a positive reputation. And the other thing that we'll note as we continue to study this is that Julius actually takes really good care of Paul during this journey and really helps save his life towards the end of the chapter based on what the other soldiers wanted to do. And then the other thing is he's joined by Luke based on the language we should be able to make the assumption there of Luke saying that he's with them, and another comrade, another friend, Aristarchus. And I know I'm messing up the pronunciation on that. But the question is, why were Paul's companions allowed to travel with him to Rome? He was just one of the many prisoners headed to Rome. What do you think? Any ideas, any thoughts on that? Why do you think Paul's companions were allowed to travel with him to Rome?
We found out last class that nobody really thought Paul needed to go to Rome. There was real crime. So
Yeah.
maybe that was why they were lenient and letting him go.
Okay, so maybe some leniency because they couldn't really figure out why he was headed to Rome. He shouldn't really be a prisoner. He had done nothing at that point in time that would justify him being put to death or being in prison. Any other thoughts? I spent some time looking through this, and some people say that they traveled with him as his physician and as his slave. They acted like that. And so that's the way that they were allowed to come, which would have been common practice under that period of time. And the advantage as well with that perspective is Julius would have seen Paul as more than just a penniless beggar that's just another prisoner. It would have put him in a higher stature. So I may need to, if I'm Julius, I may need to respect Paul just a little bit more than some of the other prisoners. So in that perspective, that may help us understand why Julius is so receptive to Paul's comments and discussions and direction as we get a little bit later. Okay. And then we jump down to the next verse, verse number 3, and that verse reads and says, "And the next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care." Now, a couple interesting points that come out of this is that goes back to what we talked about, Julius treating Paul kindly. It says it in the next verse. That's how we know it's true, right? But friends here, and some of the language that's used, a lot of the commentaries talk about probably Christians who Paul had met on his previous journeys, is what most people think that was. And then that language used for receive care, it definitely means personal needs, like clothing and those sort of things. And then some people think that also means medical care. So Paul's been in prison for some time, at this point, and he may need some medical attention. He definitely is going to need some personal needs like clothes and things like that. And so this was not a very long distance from where they started their journey. I think it was only about 70 miles. So it's kind of weird that they would stop in Sidon already, only sailing 70 miles. But that medical care could have given Luke a chance to treat Paul without it being on the rocky seas. And so there's some discussion over that making sense as we look at it. But a couple things jump out to me as we look at this verse, is that we can see that Paul depends a lot on his fellow brethren. That's one thing that jumps out quite a bit. He puts a lot of dependence, and people are willing to help him out. So in every step of his journey where people can help him out, his brethren will help him out. And when he goes to Rome, they help him out there as well. And so that got me thinking, obviously, do we help each other out? Right? That's something that we have to reflect on. But another perspective is Paul's conduct. So on a daily basis, does our conduct invite people to want to help us out? Right? Or do I always put a barrier up and try to block people out of my life? That's something I have to reflect on. Because whenever we're struggling, do people want to be there to help us out? Or are they just there because they have to be there? Because I know I need to try to do it. That's something that we can definitely reflect on and look at how Paul treated his fellow brethren. So the next, we jump down to a couple verses. In verse 6, it says, "There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy and put us on board." So the ship that they were first on when they got over here at the beginning of the journey and stopped at Sidon, now they're over here at Myra. And there they had to get on a different ship, a much bigger ship. The note calls out here, changed to a grain ship sailing to Italy. Based on what I could find, the likelihood of them starting in Caesarea Maritima and sailing all the way to Rome on the same ship was probably very low. But there at Myra, Myra was a major hub for grain importation. And going back to that map earlier, we see that Egypt is part of the Roman Empire at this point in time. And so the Egyptian grain was a staple to the Roman diet. So it's very common for those type of ships to be passing through there. And most commentaries believe that the Alexandrian is code for Egyptian. So when you see Alexandrian ship, that's an Egyptian type of ship. So what kind of ship does that look like? So I've tried to find some different pictures. This was one of them that kept coming up in different shapes and turns, but this is the one that gives you kind of an understanding of what the ship looks like. This was what a normal Roman cargo ship that would have been carrying grain back and forth would have looked like. It said that most of those typical size would carry about 250 tons of cargo. They may vary a little bit in size. Some of those carrying 200 or 100 tons up to 350 tons of cargo along those journeys. But I was curious what the ship really would have looked like, and that gives you an idea. Now we jump into the second part of the chapter, and this one we call Paul's warning is ignored. And so at this point, they're in Fair Haven on the island of Crete. If we go back, I can show you where that's at. Sorry, I didn't put that one in here. Nope, I'm going back. I'm going the wrong way. That would help if I went the right way. Oh. So now they've gone down. They've cut down to the island of Crete, which you see over on about the midpoint on the left side there. And on the southwestern side is Fair Havens. That's spelled on the map as Fair Havens. I think everywhere I've seen it's called Fair Havens. Just note that. But now they're at Fair Havens on the island of Crete. And we jump here to verses 9 and 10. It says, "Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives.'" So in verse 9, the phrase there, the feast was already over, caught my attention. And honestly, I didn't know, the fast was already over. I didn't know what they were referring to as they said the fast. So I had to look into that a little bit. But from what I could find, it refers to the Jewish Day of Atonement. And in year 59 AD, that would have fallen on October 5th. If we got the year wrong, and it is 60 AD, then that would have fallen on, I think it said September 23rd. So it gives an idea of where we're at in that period of time. Now, why is this important for us to understand? Because sailing during that period of time in the fall was considered very dangerous. So it's not a good time to be out on the water of the Mediterranean. But to sail in winter, one commentary said, was disastrous. And some of the history books from those periods of time would have said, sail at your own risk. That's how choppy the waters were. And so no doubt that they knew this. And so that was important for us to understand for that period of time. I'm going to pause here. Any questions? Any comments? Okay. I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. All right. So just stop me if you see anything. Now, there has been some discussion whether or not Paul's warning was, did God let him know about that and tell him to do the warning? Or was that just his experience? We do know, if we go and look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, you can take a moment and turn there if you want to. Paul had plenty of experience by this time with shipwrecks. On that verse it says, Paul says, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and day I have been in the deep. So he has plenty of experience. This isn't some new sailor just feeling uncomfortable with some sea legs. This is somebody that has spent considerable time and has experienced this and knows what this feels like. At this point in the journey, we do know that Fair Havens was a poor harbor for the winter season due to its exposure to the winds. And so, key point is, at this point in the journey, they had really given up on making it to Italy during this season. And they just wanted to try to find a place to settle down for the winter safely. So, based on the next few verses, we see that the centurion sided with both the captain and the owner and decided to set sail toward Phoenix, which was a little bit farther west on the island of Crete. And we don't know whether or not they took a vote or if they talked. We don't know how that decision was made, but that's how they decided to, as a group, go on to try to make its way towards Phoenix. So then if we jump down to verses 13 through 15, give me a minute to turn there. It says, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close to Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. I have struggled with that one. Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. So what does that mean? So a couple key points that jump out to us. Were they making a very bad decision? It didn't seem that the wind at that point in time was going to stop them. It was a favorable condition. So based on their discussion, and it says there in the beginning, supposing that they obtained their desire, they said, okay, this wind and the way it's blowing, it looks pretty good. We think we can make it. Now the question I had was, how far away was this port they were trying to sail to? Phoenix was only about 40 miles or so from Fair Havens. So it didn't seem like it would be that long of a journey. It seemed pretty reasonable at that period in time. So based on the size and the type of ship it was, 2 or 3 hours, they could make that journey with those winds. So it seemed reasonable. But we know it says that a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. And so what does that mean? A tempestuous wind. Luke uses a word that we get our meaning for typhoon from. So it gives you an idea. Some translations will say northeast wind. It's a very, very heavy wind. that they're not going to be able to control their sailboat in, right? I don't see anybody going out and sailing a boat in a typhoon or a hurricane, anything like that. And so that's the type of winds that they were starting to face when that happened. So it looked pretty good. They just needed good, smooth wind for a couple hours, and they would be able to make it successfully. And then what happens? Everything changes rapidly. And so from there, we've got a problem on our hands. So then we jump down and we look at verses 23 through 26. We know before we get into that, things are not going well. So if you continue to read those verses, things are not going well at all. The storm is not giving up. It's continuing to rage. In those verses that we skipped because of time, and that we see that the sailors are throwing their cargo over to lighten the ship. Many more days, it says several more days have passed in the storm so that neither sun nor stars could be seen. So think about what they would have used to give their direction. The stars, they would have used the wind to give them some direction to go. All those things are going against them. It's looking very, very bad. And at this point, their hope of being saved from the storm pretty much is lost. The morale is way down. People are not feeling good about this. And so it seems obvious during that period of time, if you were on that ship dealing with that, you probably wouldn't be very hungry, right? So people haven't been eating. And around this time, Paul stands up and says in verses 23 through 26, "For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. And therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island.'" So morale's pretty low. Paul's standing up there telling them this is going to happen because he has to be brought to Caesar. He is told that no one's going to lose their life because of this. So morale's going better, but then he puts that last bit on there. "However, we must run aground on a certain island." So you know that's got to put some doubt back in their minds a little bit. Yes, please.
I find it interesting. Go back to verse 10.
Okay, go back to verse 10.
Talking, and he said, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous, bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." So he was talking about loss of cargo and loss of lives.
Yeah.
And you go over where they were talking again, he says, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed." Why did he say that? Because last night an angel of
That's right.
God, whom I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul." So, we think of Paul sometimes as just being solid as a rock. He was afraid too.
That's right.
Maybe he and some of the other men were going to lose their lives. God understood this, sent that angel to tell him, don't fear. There's not going to be anyone hurt, no lives lost.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. So if we jump back to verse 10, what was raised is what Paul said there. "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." Right? But then we get to this section, and he says that no one's going to lose their lives. Right? Which begs the question earlier, was Paul speaking of that warning based on his own perspective? Did he just speak out because he was nervous? But now God has sent this angel to talk to him and let him know that, hey, don't be afraid, because God's going to make sure that he delivers you and all the people that are with you on this ship. So, very good point. Any other points anybody wants to raise? We've got plenty of time. Right? We're in no hurry. Okay. So I appreciate you bringing that point up. But at the end of this section here where it says, "However, we must run aground on a certain island," the challenge isn't over for them. Right? We know that they still have challenges ahead, but hopefully they will take some peace from this. But there's a lot of people on that ship that are not going to be believers, right? And so they may still have some doubts on whether Paul is really understanding what the situation is going to be or not. It says, therefore take heart, men, for I believe that God will be just as he told me. Right? That's that verse that we just read earlier. And so a couple questions that come to mind for reflection as I studied this was, do we put our faith in God when things look rough? Or we decide maybe we're going to step out and do our own thing. I don't really want to have to deal with this right now. I'm not going to be patient. I'm going to try and go and do my own idea to try to work its way through, rather than putting my faith in God. The other thing I think is interesting in the situation, it says Paul stood up. And so when those situations arise, do we stand up and encourage others that keep in mind that with God all things are possible? And so we got to put our faith and trust in the Lord to help us get through these things, rather than trying to step out on our own and maybe potentially making the situation worse. So those were just some thoughts that were going on in my head as I went through this section. We're almost finished with this part. Well, a couple other verses that stuck out to me is we jump down to verse 30 and 32. It says, and the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship when they let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. Paul said to a centurion and soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall. So it had been, if you go back a couple verses, which I didn't include on this, it had been 14 nights of this journey since Fairhaven. And so 2 weeks they had been dealing with this storm and being driven around. And so people were probably starting to doubt if this was going to happen. And so we see these sailors try to escape. Key point on this part of the chapter, though, is unlike earlier in the voyage, this time the centurion listened to what Paul had to say and stopped the sailors' plans, which I think is interesting. Before, they ignored him. You know, we go back to some of those previous verses, and they went ahead and sailed forward whenever Paul warned them of what would happen. But this time, he said, you know, Paul's probably right. We definitely need to start listening to him a little bit. And so in this one, no matter how desperate the situation we face, safety is only found in God's will, right? Making sure that we stay on the boat, right? We can't jump off because it starts to put us in some peril. Paul told us in the previous passage that we read that if we stay on there, we'll be okay. And I like this discussion because just thinking through some examples of this being true in the Bible, there's plenty of examples. The first two that came to my mind, probably because we were dealing with water, one was Noah, right? Noah building the ark, and people told him he was crazy and this wasn't going to happen and all those sort of things. They made fun of him, but he stayed true, and what God told him to do kept him in safety. The other one that came to mind was Jonah. Jonah tried to get away, right? Didn't want to carry out God's will. Took it under his own hands to go out of his way. What happens? He's swallowed up, right? And so then he had to continue to stay in God's will, and we know the rest of those stories. And there's plenty of others of those type of stories within the Bible that we get to read. But here we go. We're at the end of this section, and it says here in verse 37 through 38, it says, and in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So what's interesting about this passage, I'm going to go back. Didn't mean to go forward. Based on this passage, we know how many people are on board the grain ship. So 276 people. So there's quite a few people on this ship. The other thing that jumps out to you is that Paul knew, remember earlier we read people weren't eating because obviously they were in that storm and they were very nervous. Some other situations going on there. Paul knew that they would need to eat in order to have the strength to make it to land. So God let Paul know that they would be safe. But he didn't just sit idly beside, right? Okay, God's given us this safe passage, but they had to participate. Right? They had to participate by eating and following the plan. So that was kind of important. Is if they didn't, they may not have enough strength to make it to sea. Then we jump into the last section. I know I've got 5 minutes left. we'll be good on time. So I'm going to, the last section of this chapter starts in verse 39. So I don't have it up here on the slide, but I'm going to read 39 through 42, and then we'll have a few little discussion points. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosing the rudder ropes. And they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow struck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. So a few little key points from that passage is these were experienced sailors, but this storm was very, very rough, and they were all disoriented from the storm. They didn't really know where they were at this point in time. But God showed them how to get to safety, right? And they decided to let go of the anchors. So what does that mean? It means there's no way to stop. Once the anchors are gone, those are your brakes. It's like cutting the brake line on your car and hoping for the best. Like, there's no way to stop this. When they hoisted the mainsail, that was their way of letting the wind drive the ship ashore. But we see from that short little passage that they ran into an issue. They ran into a sandbar there where those two seas met. They're referring back to running into a sandbar, and the ship gets stuck. Began to break up due to the violence of the waves. And when that happens, what do the soldiers decide to do? Kill all the prisoners. Why? Why would they get to this point? They're getting ready to reach land. Why would they then decide to kill all the prisoners? What do you think? Please. That's right. So we have some examples of that being true, right? Where if the prisoners escape, they have to pay with their lives. Well, the soldiers don't want to get all the way to this point and then lose their lives because one of the prisoners escaped, right? But if we read ahead, in verse 33 through 44, it says, "But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land." So, for some reason, right, the centurion, believing Paul, understanding what Paul had said was true, he allowed them to make it to land safely. And so that centurion stepped in once again and made sure that Paul would be safe. I think it's interesting for that to have happened because did he believe Paul would be able to keep all the prisoners together and not escape, right? Like, what was that faith that he had in Paul at that point in time? We don't necessarily know. But. That's right. That's right. Paul had shown that he's believable, right? And what he said is going to happen and be true. So, good points. Any other comments as we reflect on chapter 27? Okay. I think I've got 1 minute left, so that was pretty good timing. So thank you all very much for your comments and your discussion. Appreciate it. And I will see you here in worship service starting in about 15 minutes. Thank you all.